The room was a sanctuary of soft shadows and familiar comfort, a place where the outside world, currently lashing against the bay window with a frantic, rain-soaked fury, ceased to exist, its threats muffled by the thick velvet curtains and the warm, golden glow of a dozen strategically placed pillar candles that painted dancing Rorschach tests on the walls and made the deep red of the wine in our glasses look almost black, like pools of ancient blood, a gathering that was as much a ritual as the one we were about to perform, a monthly unburdening of the soul among the four of us who had forged our bond in the crucible of a shared college experience over a decade ago, a bond that felt as permanent and unshakable as the earth itself. There was Chloe, my oldest friend, her laugh still the same infectious, snorting giggle that had disarmed me on our first day of freshman orientation, her pragmatic skepticism a grounding force in my often anxious life. Then there was Mark, whose gentle soul and easygoing nature had always been a safe harbor, the one who remembered everyone's favorite snack and whose apartment, with its overstuffed bookshelves and perpetually crackling fireplace, even if it was just a gas log, was our designated refuge. And finally, Sarah, my confidant, the sister I'd chosen, the keeper of my most sacred secrets, the one who had held my hair back after ill-advised tequila shots and my hand through 2 devastating breakups, her intuitive empathy a constant. Comfort, her presence a synonym for safety. We were nestled on the thick Persian rug, the Ouija board, a relic we'd found years ago in a dusty antique shop during a weekend trip, placed ceremoniously in the center of our circle, its polished wood surface gleaming in the candlelight, the letters and numbers and the stark yes and no in the corners looking both silly and sinister, a toy and a tombstone, the planchette resting inert between us, its heart-shaped window a vacant eye waiting to be filled with meaning. "All right, spirits of the great beyond," Chloe announced, raising her glass with a wry smile. "We come bearing gifts of cheap Cabernet and an open mind, slightly used, so be gentle with us." And we all laughed, the sound easy and warm, a blanket of shared history wrapping around us. And I felt a profound sense of gratitude for this, for them, for the unspoken pact that allowed us to be our truest, silliest, most vulnerable selves within these walls. A feeling so complete it was like a physical warmth in my chest. The game began, as it always did, with a lightness, a playful mockery of the whole endeavor, our fingertips resting lightly on the plastic planchette, its smooth surface cool against my skin. Mark asking if there were any spirits who could settle the debate once and for all on whether pineapple belonged on pizza. The planchette jerking with our suppressed laughter to a decisive no, which sent Chloe into a triumphant fist pump. Then Sarah asking if her missing favorite earring was behind the dresser, the planchette sliding with a surprising smoothness to yes. A coincidence we all cheered, the mood buoyant and silly, the storm outside a mere soundtrack to our cozy intimacy. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to shift, the way it always does when a group of people commits to a shared fiction. The jokes became fewer, the questions more personal, the pauses between movements longer and more charged. The only sounds the hiss of the rain, the sputter of a candle wick, and the soft, almost imperceptible scrape of the planchette against the board's varnished surface. It was Mark who asked the question that changed everything, his voice dropping into a more serious, respectful register. "Is there anyone here with us tonight? Anyone who has a message they need to share?" And for a long moment, nothing happened, and I was about to make a joke to break the tension that was suddenly coiling in the room, thick and sweet as incense smoke. But then the planchette twitched under our collective fingertips, a tiny, involuntary spasm, and began to move, not in the lazy circles of our earlier guided attempts, but with a purpose that felt alien, a slow, deliberate drift that carried it away from the center of the board, and my eyes met Sarah's across the circle, and I saw a flicker of the same unease I felt reflected in her wide, dark pupils, a silent question passing between us. It moved to yes, a clear, unambiguous declaration that landed in the silence with the weight of a stone dropped into a still pond, and the air left my lungs in a soft, startled rush. Chloe, ever the skeptic, murmured, "Okay, someone's pushing." But her voice lacked its usual conviction, and her fingers, I noticed, were trembling slightly. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper that seemed to be swallowed by the shadows in the corners of the room. And the planchette began to move again, this time with a more frantic, jagged energy, spelling out letters in a staccato rhythm that made my heart beat a matching tattoo against my ribs. Jacob, it spelled, and Mark inhaled sharply. Jacob? My Uncle Jacob? He asked, his voice thin with a mixture of hope and dread, and the planchette slid to yes again, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm, a primal finger tracing its way down my spine, because Mark's Uncle Jacob had died in a car accident 5 years ago, and the details of that loss were a sacred, painful part of Mark's history that we all respected but rarely spoke of, a fact that made this feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. We asked a few more questions, the planchette providing answers that were vague enough to be plausible, yet specific enough to be deeply unsettling. Talking about a watch and a cherry tree, things that made Mark's face pale in the candlelight, and I could feel the mood in the room solidify from playful curiosity into something dense and heavy, a shared apprehension that pressed down on us, the air growing thick and difficult to breathe, the candles seeming to flicker lower as if starved for oxygen. It was then, in that charged silence, that I made the mistake, the catastrophic error in judgment that would unravel the very fabric of my reality. Feeling a need to break this new, grim tension, to steer us back towards something lighter, I asked, my voice sounding falsely bright and brittle in my own ears. Okay, well, Mr. Jacob, do you have any messages for the rest of us? Any words of wisdom from the other side? And the moment the words left my lips, I felt the planchette go utterly still beneath our fingers, as if the entity we had contacted had been waiting for this exact cue, this specific invitation, and the silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the sound from the room, leaving only the frantic drumming of my own pulse in my ears. Then it began to move again, but this motion was different from before. It wasn't the frantic, searching movement of Jacob's responses, nor was it the playful glide of our earlier jokes. This was slow, deliberate, inexorable, like the hand of a clock counting down to a predetermined hour of doom, and it moved with a cold, terrifying certainty to the letter C. A coincidence, my brain screamed, a random starting point. It will spell cheer up, or something equally benign, but the planchette, with that same grim purpose, slid to L. And then and with each movement, a cold knot of dread began to form in the pit of my stomach, a sickening weight that pulled me downward into a void I had spent years carefully bricking over and painting to look like normal, undisturbed earth. N. The word was half-formed now, a ghastly premonition taking shape under our collective fingertips, and I could feel the eyes of my friends on me, confused, questioning, as my own breath hitched in my throat, my body recognizing the terror long before my conscious mind would allow itself to fully comprehend the word being spelled out. I, and then C, clinic. The word hung in the air between us, stark, incomprehensible, a non sequitur that made no sense in the context of a spiritual message, and Chloe broke the silence with a nervous laugh. Clinic? What does that mean? Like a free clinic? Is he telling us to get checked for STDs? Not exactly the wisdom I was hoping for, but her joke fell flat, dead on the floor between us, because the planchette wasn't done. It was moving again, and now it was heading for the numbers, and the cold in my stomach turned to a solid block of ice, because I knew, with a certainty that was both absolute and utterly paralyzing, what was coming next, the date that was seared into the deepest, most hidden part of my soul, a date I had never written down, never spoken aloud to another living soul, a private anniversary of grief and relief and shame that I visited alone in the quietest hours of the night, a date that belonged only to me. The planchette moved to 1, then 0, and my heart was hammering against my ribs now, a wild bird trapped in a cage, a frantic, panicked rhythm that made my vision swim, the candle flames blurring into streaky halos of light, the voices of my friends sounding distant and muffled, as if I were sinking deep underwater. 2, then 7. The 27th. My mouth was desert dry, my tongue a useless lump of clay, and I tried to pull my fingers away, to break this terrible connection, but they seemed frozen in place, glued to the cool plastic of the planchette. a participant in my own brutal unmasking. It moved again to 1, the month January, the heart of a winter that had matched the one in my soul, and a high-pitched whine started in my ears, drowning out Mark's soft, confused, "What is this?" 2, the year, the final, devastating digit, and as the planchette settled on the 2, completing the date, October 27th, 12, a sound escaped my lips, a small, strangled gasp that was barely human, and I finally wrenched my hand back as if the board had burned me, the connection broken, the planchette falling lifelessly onto its side on the board, the eye of its window staring blankly up at the ceiling. The silence that followed was the most profound and terrifying sound I have ever heard, a void filled with unasked questions and dawning confusion, and I could feel their eyes on me, 3 pairs of them, boring into me, seeing through the carefully constructed facade of my present self into the raw, terrified girl of that day, and my skin crawled with the exposure. A violation so complete it felt like being flayed alive, my secret, my pain, my most private self laid bare on a cheap piece of cardboard for my closest friends to gawk at. "What the hell was that?" Chloe asked, her voice hushed, all traces of skepticism gone, replaced by a genuine, bewildered alarm. "Clinic? October 27th, 2012? Does that mean anything to anyone?" Mark added, his brow furrowed in concern, looking from Sarah's pale, shocked face to mine, which I knew must be a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. I somehow found my voice, a thin, reedy thing that didn't sound like my own, and forced out a lie. "No, nothing, it's gibberish, just random. It doesn't mean anything." I stammered, pushing myself up from the floor, my legs trembling so violently I thought I would collapse. I have a splitting headache from the candles, the wine. I think I need to go, I'm sorry." And I practically fled the room, grabbing my coat and bag, not looking back, ignoring their concerned calls after me, stumbling out into the rain-lashed night where the cold air did nothing to cool the feverish shame burning on my cheeks. The drive home a blur of tears and trembling hands on the steering wheel. Every shadow outside the car feeling like a judgment, every beat of the wipers a mocking. Repetition of that date, October 27th, 12, October 27th, 12. The night that followed was an eternity of sleepless torment, my mind a frantic, caged animal running through every possible explanation. A cruel, cosmic joke? A real spirit, some malignant ghost that had rummaged through the attic of my soul and pulled out its most painful artifact to display. But each possibility was more absurd and terrifying than the last. And the only thing that felt real was the gut-wrenching certainty that my secret was out, that the foundation of trust upon which my friendships were built had been irrevocably shattered by a force I could not understand or control. I replayed every moment of the evening, every glance, every word, every micro-expression on my friends' faces, searching for a clue, a flicker of knowledge, a hint of betrayal, but it was all a chaotic jumble, a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. The 4 walls of my bedroom feeling like they were closing in on me. The silence screaming the word clinic over and over again. The next day was a torture of forced normalcy, of texting the group chat a lame excuse about a migraine, and being met with a chorus of concerned replies that felt like barbs, each one a reminder of their kindness and my own deception, of their ignorance and my horrific knowledge, and the weight of it was crushing me, making it hard to breathe, to think, to function. It was Sarah who called me that evening, her voice soft and hesitant on the line. "Hey, can I come over? I need to talk to you about last night." And my heart plummeted through the floor because I knew with a sickening certainty that this was it, the moment of confrontation, and I managed a week sure. Before hanging up and sinking onto my sofa, my body thrumming with a dread so potent it was a taste in my mouth, metallic and cold. She arrived looking as haunted as I felt, her face drawn, her eyes avoiding mine as she sat beside me, not on her usual spot right next to me, but a careful, telling distance away, and the space between us on the couch felt like a canyon, filled with all the unspoken things that were about to destroy us. She didn't speak for a long time, just twisted her hands in her lap, and the silence was a physical pressure in the room, and I wanted to scream, to beg her to just say it, to end this agony, but I was frozen, waiting for the blow to fall. When she finally spoke, Her voice was so quiet I had to lean in to hear her, and each word was a shard of glass, meticulously carving out my heart. "I saw you," she began, and the world stopped turning, the air itself seeming to solidify around us. That day, October 27th, 2012, I was driving back from my cousin's place downtown. I was stuck at that long light at the corner of Elm and 8th, and I saw you coming out of the women's health clinic. She finally looked at me then, and her eyes were filled with a terrible, gut-wrenching guilt. You were alone. You were wearing that gray peacoat you had back then, the one with the big buttons, and you had your arms wrapped around yourself, and you just looked hollow. I almost called out to you, I almost honked, but I didn't. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if you'd want me to see you. The light changed, and I drove away. She took a shuddering breath, tears now streaming down her face. I never told anyone. I never, ever meant to. It felt like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, something private. But I never forgot it. The image of you there, looking so alone, it stuck with me. The question of it stuck with me. I was worried about you. I wondered if you were okay, but it never felt like my place to ask. I buried it. I thought I'd buried it so deep. Her confession was a worse horror than any ghost story, a violation more intimate than any spectral message could ever be. And I stared at her, my mind reeling, trying to process this truth that was so much more mundane and so much more devastating than any supernatural explanation. Last night, she continued, her voice breaking, when we were asking questions, when we were all so focused and quiet, it just popped into my head. That image of you outside the clinic. That date. It was just there in the front of my mind, this question I'd never asked. And my fingers. I swear to you, I wasn't consciously moving it. I didn't mean to. I would never do that to you. But I felt this pull. It felt like the planchette was moving on its own, but it was moving toward that memory. It was like my subconscious, my stupid, buried curiosity. It took over. I gave it a voice. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. The truth landed not with a bang, but with a suffocating, silent weight, collapsing the world I knew into a single, horrifying point. There was no ghost, no demon, no cosmic intrusion, just a friend, a memory, and the silent, insidious power of a secret that was never entirely mine alone. The Ouija board was just a piece of wood. The spirit was the specter of Sarah's unvoiced knowledge, her silent witness, her buried question given form through the ideomotor effect, a psychological phenomenon I'd read about and dismissed, a quirk of the human mind that had now become the engine of my personal ruin. The horror was not in the otherworldly, but in the devastatingly worldly. It was in the human frailty, the failed act of forgetting, the casual cruelty of chance that placed her at that red light on that day. The terrifying truth that our most intimate secrets are not buried with us, but are carried, like dormant viruses, in the minds of others, waiting for a moment of collective suggestion to break out and poison everything. I didn't scream at her. I didn't cry. I just sat there numb, the foundations of my reality turned to ash, because the person I had trusted most in the world had, without malice but with irrevocable consequence, held the key to my deepest shame all along. And the board had simply been the lock it turned in. She left eventually, after more tearful apologies that I could not absorb, and I sat in the deepening twilight of my living room, the walls that had once felt like a shelter now feeling like a prison, and I understood that the true terror wasn't about what had happened in the past, but about the unbearable fragility of the present, the knowledge that safety is an illusion, that trust is a vase that, once broken, can never be fully mended, and that the most frightening hauntings are not of places, but of people, the ghosts of their knowledge, their memories, their silent, unseen judgments that now colored every interaction, every glance, every laugh shared with Chloe, with Mark, with Sarah, especially with Sarah, because how could I ever look at her again without seeing the woman who saw me, without wondering what other secrets of mine she was carrying, what other questions were buried in the quiet, dusty archives of her mind, waiting for a parlor game to give them a voice? The planchette didn't move by itself. It was guided by the hidden hand of a friend's subconscious, and that was a truth more chilling than any ghost. a horror so profound and personal that it redefined every relationship I had, turning every smile into a potential mask and every comforting word into a possible lie, leaving me alone in a crowded room of people I thought I knew, forever haunted by the devastatingly simple human truth that we are never truly alone with our secrets. The silence after her confession was not merely an absence of sound, but a positive, suffocating entity that filled my living room, pressing down on the furniture, on my lungs, on my very soul, a thick, woolen blanket of awful understanding that smothered all possibility of the life I had known just minutes before, a life where my past was my own private country to which I held the only passport, a life where Sarah was my sanctuary and not the architect of this devastating exposure, and I could only sit there on the couch, the fabric of the cushion rough against my trembling hands, and stare at a water stain on the ceiling I'd never noticed before, a Rorschach blot that seemed to morph and pulse in the dimming light, a meaningless shape onto which I could project the screaming chaos inside my head, a chaos that was now permanently, inextricably tethered to the image of Sarah in her car, her hands on the steering wheel, her eyes, her kind, empathetic eyes, registering my presence on that gray sidewalk, capturing me in a moment of ultimate vulnerability, and then filing it away, a mental photograph she never showed me, but that had developed in the darkroom of her subconscious for years, waiting for the eerie chemistry of the Ouija board to bring it into horrifying focus. Her tears, her apologies, they were real. I knew that on some intellectual level. I could see the genuine anguish contorting her features, the way her shoulders hunched as if bearing a physical weight. But they landed on me like rain on a frozen lake, unable to penetrate the sheet of ice that had instantly formed around my heart, a protective permafrost against the searing heat of this betrayal, because it was a betrayal, regardless of her intent, a violation of the unspoken pact of privacy. That is the very bedrock of deep friendship, the understanding that some things are seen and never spoken of, some wounds are witnessed and never probed, some secrets are intuited and left to rest in peace. She kept saying, "I didn't mean to, it was my subconscious, it just came out." And each iteration was another twist of the knife, because it underscored the terrifying randomness of it all, the sheer dumb luck of her being at that intersection at that exact moment years ago, the neurological fluke that disinterred that specific memory during that specific game, a catastrophic alignment of chance and psychology that felt more cruel and capricious than any deliberate act of malice could ever be. If she had done it on purpose, I could hate her, I could rage against her, I could neatly sever the tie and cauterize the wound. But this was a tragedy of errors with no villain, only victims, and that made the entire situation feel hopelessly, irreparably broken. I finally found my voice, though it sounded alien and flat, stripped of all emotion by the shock, and I said, "You should go now, Sarah." And the use of her full name instead of the usual Sar, or Bear, or "you idiot," hung in the air between us, a formal eviction notice served on a decade of intimacy. And she flinched as if I'd struck her, nodding mutely, her face a mess of tears and smudged mascara, and she stood up, unsteady, and walked to the door without another word, pausing for a moment, with her hand on the knob as if hoping for a reprieve, for me to call her back, to absolve her, to somehow make this okay. But I just kept staring at that damn water stain on the ceiling, my gaze fixed and unblinking, until I heard the soft click of the latch engaging, the sound of the door closing behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty rooms of my apartment and the newly hollowed-out chambers of my heart. The days that followed were a study in a new kind of solitude, a profound isolation that persisted even in crowds, at work, in the grocery store, because I now carried this knowledge that the past was not a locked box I alone possessed the key to. It was a shared, communal space, and others had wandered through it, picking up artifacts of my pain and pocketing them, and I had no way of knowing who else had seen me, who else knew, what other fragments of my most private self were held in the minds of casual acquaintances, of strangers stopped at red lights, their eyes briefly registering my presence before moving on with their lives, their memories of me fossilized in amber, waiting for some random trigger to bring them back to the surface. Every interaction became a minefield of potential exposure, a casual question from Mark, Hey, you feeling better from the other night? That migraine sounded brutal. Sent me into a spiral of paranoia, my mind racing. Was there a new knowing edge to his voice? Had Sarah told him despite her promises? Was this a coded message, a test? Chloe texted a silly meme about a ghost holding a bottle of aspirin, and I stared at it for 10 minutes, dissecting every pixel for hidden meaning, for a veiled reference to clinics or dates or secrets. My laughter in response a hollow, performative act that felt like a betrayal of my own turmoil. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the periphery of my friendships, watching my friends interact with the version of me they thought they knew, the unburdened me, the me whose history wasn't a subject of parlor games, and the gap between their perception and my reality felt like an unbridgeable chasm, a void into which my sanity was slowly leaching. I avoided the group chat, letting messages pile up, offering excuses about being swamped with work, and the silence from my phone began to feel accusatory, each unanswered notification a tiny judgment, and I knew I couldn't keep this up forever, that eventually the fabric of our friendship would fray beyond repair under the strain of my absence. But the thought of seeing them, of sitting in that same room, of making eye contact with Sarah, was physically nauseating, a prospect that tied my stomach into knots of pure dread. I replayed the Ouija board night on a continuous, torturous loop in my mind, but now with the terrible clarity of hindsight, and I could see it all so differently. The slight hesitation in Sarah's posture when the planchette first moved, the almost imperceptible tightening of her fingertips that I had mistaken for nervous excitement, but now recognized as the first tremor of that buried memory stirring. The way her eyes had flickered to me for a fraction of a second after the C was spelled A. Glance I'd read as shared curiosity, but now understood as a dawning, horrified recognition from the deepest part of her brain, a part she wasn't even consciously controlling. The planchette didn't move on its own. It had moved guided by the microscopic tensions in her muscles, the electrical impulses of a forgotten memory firing neurons, commanding her hand to betray me, and the horror of that my friend's body had been used as a puppet by a ghost of her own making to act out my deepest shame, was a concept so violating it made my skin crawl. I stopped sleeping, the darkness behind my eyelids providing a perfect screen for the relentless replay of that night, the scrape of the planchette, the confused faces of my friends, Sarah's tearful confession, and when I did manage to drift off, my dreams were surreal, panicked landscapes where I was forever walking out of that clinic door only to find Sarah, Chloe, and Mark standing on the sidewalk holding the Ouija board like a mirror, reflecting my image back at me, and I'd wake up gasping, my heart hammering, the sheets soaked with a cold sweat. I became hyper-aware of my own body, of the secret it held, and it felt like everyone could see it, like the date was branded on my forehead, the word clinic flashing over me like a neon sign. And I found myself wearing higher collars, longer sleeves, as if I could physically conceal the truth that had already been exposed. The psychological fallout was a quiet, internal avalanche, burying the person I was under tons of fear and suspicion, and a grief so profound it was for my own lost sense of safety, my lost trust in the narrative of my own life. The world had not changed. The sun still rose, people still went to work, coffee still brewed, but my lens on it had been permanently smudged, coated in the greasy film of this knowledge, and the most terrifying entity I could now conceive of was not a demon or a vengeful spirit, but the human mind itself, its capacity to record, to store, to forget, and then remember at the worst possible moment, its power to betray its owner and everyone they love through the simple, unconscious act of recollection. The Ouija board was inert, packed away in a closet, but the real game of chance continued every day, a terrifying lottery where the prize was the integrity of my own history, and I was suddenly aware that I was surrounded by countless potential players, each carrying their own set of memories, their own silent witnesses to moments I thought were mine alone, and the question that now haunted me, the true and thrilling end to this nightmare, was not who had been contacted that night, but what other secrets were yet to be spoken. What other truths were waiting in the minds of my friends, my family, my colleagues, biding their time? waiting for the right combination of suggestion and subconscious urge to finally give them a voice and shatter my world all over again. The horror was in the mundane, the human, the real, and it was a horror from which there was no waking up, no burning of the board, no closing of the circle. It was simply the new reality, a life sentence of looking over my shoulder at my own past, forever wondering who else was standing there watching. A week passed, a blur of gray hours and sleepless nights. Each day a performance of normalcy, so exhausting I would collapse into bed at night feeling more drained than if I had run a marathon. My mind the only thing still racing, sprinting in frantic circles around the central, unchangeable fact of what had happened, and the texts from the group chat became less frequent. The cheerful pings of planned brunches and movie nights now replaced by a more concerned, hesitant tone, messages directly to me from Chloe and Mark asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, their worry a palpable thing I could feel through the screen. A kindness that now felt like a burden, because I had to concoct ever more elaborate lies to keep them at bay, to preserve the fragile fiction that nothing was wrong, that I was just busy, just tired, just working through a rough patch, all the while knowing that Sarah was likely fielding her own concerned queries, maintaining her own awful silence, the two of us, locked in a secret standoff that was poisoning the well for everyone. I couldn't avoid them forever, and the inevitable summons came in the form of a text from Mark, his gentle persistence impossible to refuse, suggesting a casual dinner at his place. Just the four of us, no Ouija boards, no spooky games, just pizza and a bad movie, a return to the familiar comfort of our baseline, and the message felt like a verdict. A command performance I had to attend lest my absence itself become the confirmation of whatever suspicions they might be harboring. The hours leading up to it were a special kind of torture, my hands shaking so badly I could barely apply my makeup, the concealer I dabbed under my eyes feeling like a pathetic attempt to mask not just the dark circles of exhaustion, but the deeper, spiritual bruising that colored my entire being. And I chose my clothes with a frantic, paranoid care, rejecting anything I might have worn around that time in 2012. Anything gray that might trigger another synaptic misfire in someone's brain. Finally settling on a bright red sweater that felt like a costume, the uniform of a woman who was fine, who was happy, who had not had her soul scoured raw. Walking into Mark's apartment was like stepping onto a stage where I had forgotten my lines. The familiar smells of garlic bread and lemon polish, the comforting clutter of books and vinyl records, the same worn sofa. It was all the same, yet everything was different, the air itself charged with the unspoken thing that sat among us like a fifth, malevolent guest. Sarah arrived last, and the moment she walked in, our eyes met for a fraction of a second before skittering away, a flash of mutual, paralyzing awareness that was more telling than any words could ever be. And I saw her hands were trembling as she took off her coat, and the sight of her vulnerability should have softened me, but it only made me feel more trapped, more resentful that her guilt was now a thing I had to manage alongside my own devastation. We went through the motions with a stilted, painful politeness, passing bowls of salad, complimenting Mark on his homemade pizza crust, making forced conversation about work, about the weather, about the movie he'd chosen, a lightweight comedy that none of us watched, the laughter from the television a jarring, ironic counterpoint to the leaden silence that filled the spaces between our sentences. I could feel Sarah's gaze on me throughout the evening, fleeting, worried glances that felt like laser points on my skin, and I kept my own eyes fixed on my plate or on the screen, terrified that if I looked at her, if I truly saw the friend I had loved and trusted, the dam would break and I would either scream or sob, and I couldn't do that. I had to hold it together. I had to prove that I was unchanged, even though I was fundamentally, irrevocably altered. It was Chloe, of course, who finally breached the careful wall of pretense we'd built, because Chloe's pragmatism couldn't abide the elephant in the room forever. She muted the television during a loud car chase, and the sudden silence was deafening, and she said, her voice carefully neutral, "Okay, what the hell is going on with you two?" Looking directly at me, and then at Sarah. "You've both been acting like zombies for a week, and you won't look at each other. Did you have a fight? Did something happen after we left that night?" The directness of the question was a bucket of ice water thrown on the tense, performative atmosphere, and I felt my carefully constructed composure crack, my heart seizing in my chest, and I saw Sarah pale, her eyes wide with panic, and in that moment, the fragile truce of our silence shattered, and the choice presented itself. I could lie, I could weave another thread into the web of deception, I could protect the secret yet again, or I could let it out. I could finally speak the truth that had already been given voice by a piece of plastic and a forgotten memory. The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them, fueled by a week of sleepless torment and the unbearable weight of the performance, my voice low and ragged, stripped of all pretense. The board, it wasn't random. I couldn't look at any of them, my gaze fixed on a knot in the wood of Mark's dining table. The date it gave, October 27th, 2012. It meant something. I felt, rather than saw, Mark and Chloe lean forward, their confusion shifting into a dawning, intense focus, and I could feel Sarah's silent plea from across the table, a desperate energy begging me to stop. But it was too late. The truth, once uncaged, would not be forced back in. I was at a clinic that day, I whispered, the words tasting like ash, each one a struggle to push past the constriction in my throat. A women's health clinic. I had a procedure. I didn't say the word, I couldn't, but the meaning hung in the air, clear and devastating. I never told anyone. I thought no one knew. I finally chanced to glance at Sarah, and her face was a mask of anguish, tears already streaming down her cheeks. And that was all the confirmation Chloe and Mark needed. The story tumbled out of me then in broken, halting sentences. Not the story of the procedure itself, but the story of that night, of Sarah's confession, of the horrific coincidence of her seeing me, of her buried memory, finding its way to the surface through the Ouija board, a psychological haunting more real than any ghost. I told it all, my voice flat and exhausted, the fight gone out of me. And when I finished, the room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, a mundane sound that underscored the surreal horror of the conversation. Chloe was the first to speak, her voice soft with a stunned compassion. "Oh my God," she breathed, looking from me to Sarah, her pragmatic worldview undoubtedly struggling to reconcile this bizarre, human tragedy. "Sarah, is that true?" And Sarah could only nod, weeping openly now, her body curled in on itself with shame. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, the words directed at me, at all of us. "I never meant. I forgot I even knew. I would never." Mark, ever the peacemaker, the empath, reached out and put a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that felt, to me, like a betrayal, a choosing of sides, and he said, "It was an accident, a crazy, terrible accident." And while his words were meant to soothe, they landed on me like a condemnation, because an accident implied there was no one to blame, which meant there was no one to be angry at, which meant this pain had no outlet, no resolution. It was just a fact, a boulder dropped in our path that we could neither move nor go around. The conversation that followed was a messy, emotional tangle of reassurances and questions, of Chloe expressing her support for me, of Mark trying to rationalize the inexplicable mechanics of the subconscious, of Sarah apologizing over and over until the words lost all meaning. And I sat through it all, numb, detached, watching them process my trauma as a group, making it a shared event. And I felt a bizarre, terrifying sense of loss, because my secret was no longer mine. It was now a piece of our group's history, a story they would carry with them, and I had no control over how they carried it, what they thought of it, what they thought of me. The evening ended not with a resolution, but with a fragile, exhausted truce, with hugs that felt stiff and unnatural, with promises to talk more, to work through it, and driving home, the darkness outside my car windows felt absolute, a void that matched the one inside me. The aftermath of that confession was not the catharsis I might have naively hoped for. Instead of feeling unburdened, I felt exposed in a new, more profound way. The secret was out, but the weight of it was different, not lighter but distributed, a shared burden that somehow felt heavier because it required my constant management of their feelings, their pity, their careful, tiptoeing conversations. My friendship with Sarah was a ghost of its former self, a polite, distant exchange of texts and occasional meetings that were so strained they were almost painful. The deep, easy intimacy we'd shared replaced by a vast minefield of topics we could no longer discuss, of memories we could no longer revisit without the shadow of that day falling over us. With Chloe and Mark, things were better, but there was a new carefulness in their tone, a hesitation, as if they were afraid of saying the wrong thing, of triggering me. And I hated it. I hated being seen as fragile, as broken, as the girl with the abortion secret. That single aspect of my history now defining me in their eyes, overshadowing a decade of shared jokes and triumphs and support. The real horror, the thrilling end that settled into my bones and made a home there, was not the single event of the Ouija board, but the permanent alteration of my reality. Trust was no longer a given but a calculated risk. Memory was not a private sanctuary but a leaky vessel, and every friendship, every relationship, now had to be viewed through this new, terrifying lens of what they might know, what they might have seen, what hidden memories might lie dormant in their minds, waiting for the right trigger to ambush us all. The planchette had stopped moving that night, but the game was far from over. It had simply changed, and now every conversation, every glance, every shared silence was a move on a board I never agreed to play on, and I was forever waiting for the next secret to be spelled out, letter by devastating letter.